How's everybody doing? So, second to last session at TechEd, right? It's a marathon, it's not a sprint. I hope everybody at least some point during the week got some sort of sleep and ate something other than ice cream and Red Bull and something along, no, not even a chance of that. Okay, well, regardless, I've got a pretty interesting topic for the second to last session that I think is going to be pretty engaging. So it's a good selection for the second to last session on the very last day of TechEd this year. For those of you that I haven't had a chance to meet down at the booth or at other conferences, my name's Chris Mayo. I'm a senior technical evangelist for the Office 365 team. Specifically, I focus on the platform. So how do you build solutions for Office 365, including the various services, SharePoint Online, Lync Online, and Exchange Online? And in this session, we're going to be focusing on building collaboration workflows for SharePoint Online. And if you've been doing any work with SharePoint Online as of yet, or have read anything on the web or in MSDN magazine or whatnot, you know that SharePoint Online is based on SharePoint 2010, so it picks up a lot of those same features and platform capabilities. It's not 100% parity, but it is very close. You also know that there are differences, particularly with the platform. On the SharePoint Online platform, the only solution type that is supported is sandbox solutions, right? Which prevents you from doing code-based workflows. But it doesn't prevent you from doing workflows. We can actually build workflows, declarative workflows that are deployed as sandbox solutions with SharePoint Designer and augment them with code by building custom actions for those workflows and using Visual Studio 2010 and building sandbox solutions that include those custom actions. So that's what we're going to be covering over the course of the next hour. And I'm going to leave plenty of time at the end for us to answer questions and have discussion and so on, with lots and lots of time for demos as well. So here's what we're going to cover. I'm going to do a brief overview of SharePoint Online, just so you kind of know what it is and how it is similar to or different from SharePoint 2010. If you missed my session yesterday, OSP 305, we're going to have that recorded, which I go into SharePoint Online quite in depth there and some other solution types, talking about sandbox solutions, the client object model, and so on. From there, we'll start talking about workflow. We'll talk about prototyping in Visio 2010. That's an option that can help you get started with a workflow very quickly. We'll talk about implementing workflows declaratively with SharePoint Designer 2010. We'll talk about building those custom actions with Visual Studio and Sandbox Solutions. And then finally, we'll talk about the most important portion, actually getting these deployed to SharePoint Online and how do you do that. We'll wrap up and have some resources that I think will be helpful for you to build your own workflows when you get back to the office, working with Office 365 and SharePoint Online. And then, like I said, I plan on leaving 15 minutes or so for us to talk and answer questions and so on. So how many folks have an Office 365 beta account today? OK, so about half. So Office 365 is the next generation of business productivity online services, or Microsoft Online services. Office 365 includes SharePoint Online, Exchange Online, and Lync Online. And the big difference with this particular version of the cloud service is that SharePoint Online, Lync Online, and Exchange Online are all going to be based on the 2010 versions of those servers, right? So BPOS today, we have millions of customers and thousands of companies that are using that service. It's based on the 2007 versions of the servers. So we're in beta today. When we release within the first half of this year, the new service is going to be based on the 2010 servers, which picks up, again, the 2010, like, for example, SharePoint 2010 features and SharePoint 2010 developer story, for the most part. And there are differences. And I've actually posted on my blog a link to the service descriptions, which actually goes line by line, feature by feature, and says, what feature is that are supported on 2010 are or are not supported on SharePoint Online. So you can actually see what the feature difference is. We'll talk about some of the platform differences today. Again, it's not 100% parity, but if you're used to doing sandbox solutions with SharePoint 2010 or client object model, what you know as far as SharePoint 2010 development definitely applies to SharePoint Online, again, because SharePoint Online is based on SharePoint 2010. So SharePoint Online is SharePoint 2010 hosted in the cloud as software as a service. Again, Microsoft runs the data center, this cloud data center that all the services run in. It's a multi-tenant, highly scalable, geo-distributed environment. We take care of the reliability. In fact, we have a 99.9% uptime SLA, and it's a financially backed SLA. So if it dips below that 99.9%, we pay your subscription fee back for that downtime. It's also secure. We've gone through the process of getting ISO and SAS certified as far as the security of not only the software and the data, but also the physical infrastructure as far as the data centers and where they're located, the various data centers throughout the world. And then, as I had mentioned earlier, it's a subset of the actual online features. Some features didn't make sense in a multi-tenant environment, or we felt that they were better to re-engineer them for the next version. So again, not 100% feature parity and not 100% platform parity. But I have some resources at the end so you can see exactly what the feature differences are and exactly what the platform differences are. And we'll focus on the workflow differences during this session. So SharePoint Online only supports sandbox solutions, right? Sandbox solutions are awesome from the perspective that they are very, very easy to develop with the help that Visual Studio 2010 gives you. It is a scoped environment both in the API as well as what you can do in that environment. But it has the one big benefit of the fact that you can upload these solutions to the solution gallery, just like uploading a document to a document library. A solution gallery is actually just a specialized document library. And they're deployed essentially friction-free compared to like a full trust application where you have to push files out to the front-end server and maybe change web.config or register something in the GAC and so on. But there is a cost associated with that ease of deployment and ease of development. And one of those things is that you can't do full trust solutions. So that prevents you from doing code-based workflows, including sequential workflows and state machine workflows. But you can do what we call declarative workflows, or workflows that are done declaratively via XAML markup. And that's exactly what you do with SharePoint Designer and SharePoint Designer support for authoring workflows. You can optionally prototype those workflows in Visio 2010. The nice thing about that is it's a great way to communicate the workflow with the stakeholder, the person that's writing the check for the solution that you're building. That workflow can then be exported from Visio and imported into SharePoint Designer to give you a leg up on the actual development of the workflow. SharePoint Designer, which is new with 2010, has a new workflow designer that makes it very easy to implement workflows, even complex workflows. And we'll see that in the demo here. It integrates with InfoPath 2010 as far as providing you forms to collect and validate data from your users. A lot of those forms are generated automatically, and of course you can augment them. And one of the coolest things about doing workflows as far as SharePoint Online is concerned and declarative workflows is the fact that you can do code. So you can do a bulk of the work with the actions and conditions that are built into SharePoint Designer, but in an instance where you find something that you can't do in SharePoint Designer because it doesn't have an out-of-the-box action, you can extend your workflow with a custom action. And you can do anything in that custom action that you could do in a sandbox solution. Okay, so it's very, very powerful. If you saw the foundational session that we did with Aaron Kelly on the first day here at TechEd, you saw that we had a website that when you created a new course, deployed a new site, and that site had all the right document libraries, content types, lists. It actually had workflows deployed in that site and all the content and branding and so on. We did that with a declarative workflow and a bunch of custom actions. Okay, just to give you an idea of the power of these custom actions and what you can do. And again, that's another session that we have recorded if you want to check that out when you get back to the office after TechEd. And then finally, the most important part of this is that you can deploy these solutions as WSPs or as package files, Sandbox Solutions package files. And it is kind of a misconception about SharePoint Designer. A lot of people think that by default, SharePoint Designer just like works directly against the site, right, and kind of is just updating it, live on the site. You can actually create workflows that are essentially detachable, reusable to be used in other solutions. And I'll show you how I do my development in such a way that I can develop locally on my machine, get the workflow that I need, and then deploy that with the rest of the WSPs for my solution. Okay, so again, since SharePoint Online is based on SharePoint 2010, it picks up a lot of the SharePoint 2010 features. And that includes the new workflow targets as well. So being able to do things like create reusable workflows. These are actually the workflows that you can distribute because they're not bound to a particular list or a particular site. Again, it packages up as a WSP that you can distribute. Site workflows are now supported, so you can actually apply a workflow to a site based on either a manual start, a human-started workflow, or an automated event like something changing in the site or something being added to the site. There's new workflow events like workflow started and workflow stopped that you can trigger and run code on those, which is helpful for creating fairly sophisticated solutions. And then prototyping in Visio 2010, as I had mentioned before, gives you an opportunity to kind of design the workflow, or if someone gives you a Visio document, you can import that into SharePoint Designer and start building your workflow. Like you can see this sample here that we're going to be working with during the demo. In fact, let's go ahead and go right into this machine over here and actually take a look at this. Take a look at Visio right quick. So this is my development environment. I've got my laptop here. It's running a virtual machine. It's actually the information worker virtual machines that you can download from MSDN that gives you a full development environment for SharePoint. And I've got a site here that I've created. It's called Chris Mayo's O365 on-premises demo site. I'm going to be doing all of my development against this local instance of SharePoint 2010. And I do that so I can, iteratively do my development either through SharePoint Designer or Visual Studio 2010. I get F5 debugging support since it's a local instance of SharePoint. When I'm done, I package this up into a solution as a bunch of WSPs, and I distribute it by uploading it to the solution gallery to my SharePoint Online site. And that's what this site here is. You can see I just named them differently so you can see which one I'm working in. My on-premises site just says on-premises in the title, and my online site says online in the title. Okay? So I'm going to start off building out my application. Let's say that someone handed me a Visio diagram. And the scenario is this, is that from the session yesterday, we created a solution that deployed a list called the non-standard business purchases request list. And it's for people in the fictional Contoso enterprise who, when they want to purchase something that's not purchased through the normal procurement channels, they go up and they enter items into this list. And we created a WSP or a sandbox solution that deployed the list. Then we created another sandbox solution that deployed a Silverlight application and manipulates the list. That was in that OSP 305 session yesterday. In this session, what we're going to do is we're actually going to implement a workflow on top of that list. So when someone enters a request, they can start a workflow to have it approved. And this is the general flow of the workflow. We're going to start an approval process. So that'll send out a task to everyone in the approvers group so they can. That task will include information about what the request is, how much does it cost, who made it, and so on. We'll log the result of that decision into the history list. And then based on whether the request was approved or denied, we're just going to take some extra actions to kind of simulate, or in a demo scenario, kind of show that we can make decisions based on data within the list or data within the workflow itself. If it was approved, I'm going to go ahead and send an email to let the person know that they can order that thing. If it's rejected, I'm going to send them an email to let them know that it was rejected. I'm going to delete the item. And again, this diagram was created with the SharePoint template that ships with Visio 2010, and it includes a bunch of conditions like comparing data sources or asking for permissions on the user to control the flow of the workflow. I've got actions like sending an email or collecting information from the user or pausing and waiting until a date and so on. But these are actions that actually turn into real actions in SharePoint Designer, so you can actually implement the workflow based on this diagram. Okay? So if I wanted to use this diagram, and again, this is optional, but if I wanted to use this diagram to actually build out the workflow, I just go to the Process tab and click Export. And what that's going to do is it's going to export this diagram as a Visio workflow interchange file, which is something that can be imported into SharePoint Designer to actually implement the workflow. Again, it's optional, but it's a great way if you just want to quickly design something, or if you get a Visio diagram from someone in this template, it's easy to get started building the actual workflow that way. Okay, and I've got some background slides on this as well. But I think where we want to spend most of our time here is in SharePoint Designer and in Visual Studio 2010. So SharePoint Designer was released with SharePoint 2010, and it's been vastly updated. It's a great tool, kind of a power tool, or a good supplement to Visual Studio 2010 for doing things like working with data, so creating lists and content types and document types and so on, doing design as far as applying style sheets or customizing master pages, creating site templates, and in our case, working with workflows. It's got a new user interface, so it's much easier to get around. It's got the ribbon UI and the fluent UI. I actually use it quite a bit to when I'm deploying solutions and something doesn't go well. It's a great way to kind of peek into some of the background, the behind-the-scenes libraries. Like there's a library called Workflows that is hidden under Site Assets that you can actually see all the workflow files that were deployed, so you can see if maybe something that you expected to get there didn't get there. I use it to see when I deploy Silverlight applications, maybe it went to the wrong location. I need to work on my modules or whatever. But it's a great tool. And of course, it's free. So it's a free download that you can download from the SharePoint Designer site and use within your SharePoint 2010 solutions. But when we talk about workflows, again, this tool was released with SharePoint 2010. SharePoint Online is based on 2010, so it provides the same kind of support as far as being able to do list workflows that are bound directly to a list, or site workflows that are bound directly to a site. In our case, when you're creating a solution that's kind of above and beyond just a very simple workflow, you're going to want to use the reusable workflow, because the reusable workflow lets you bind to a content type and actually save that workflow once you have it up and running as a WSP that you can distribute with the rest of your solution. And that's what we'll actually do within the demos today. Now, when you start a workflow, you can create it in a number of different ways. You can create it just by importing a Visio document and have that generate the base of the workflow, and you kind of just fill in the blanks. You can create it from scratch just by saying, give me a new list-based, reusable, or site-based workflow. And lastly, and this is a really great feature, particularly when you want to learn how to do some deep customization on some of the built-in workflows like collect signatures or get approval or whatever. You can create a workflow based on a built-in workflow just by selecting it and saying copy. And it'll actually copy and create a new workflow for you with all of the same options and start options and complete options and so on as the original workflow. And I'll show you that here in a second. So the workflow summary page is kind of the control center for your workflow. You can determine how the workflow starts and how it ends. The task designer gives you the ability to customize tasks like an approval task. How do you want that approval to be started? How do you want it to end? What is it going to do when it ends? Those kinds of things. And then the workflow designer is actually where you do the work as far as applying actions and conditions and steps along the processing of that workflow to actually get the work done. Okay? So I mentioned the different ways you can create workflows. They can be list-based, they can be reusable, they can be site workflows. The copy and modify option gives you the ability to, again, create workflows based on the built-in approval, collect feedback, collect signatures, or publishing approval. And you just go up into the ribbon, you select the workflow you want, and select copy and modify. The actions are actually how you get work done. So it's everything from, hey, I want to send an email to I want to check an item in or check an item out, or enter an item in a list or delete an item in a list. Conditions are actually what controls the flow of the workflow, so they can check on either data within a list or attributes of a document in a document library, or they can check and use variables within your workflow to control the flow of the actual workflow. And then steps are how you both organize your workflow, but they also control how the actions in your workflow actually function. So the first thing that they do is they kind of organize different areas of your workflow. So if you have a very, very long workflow, just like code comments help you kind of organize organize and document what the code is doing, you can create steps and put conditions and actions in those steps and say, okay, here I'm going to collect signatures, here I'm going to check the document out and make the modifications I need, and then here I'm going to archive the document. So you can create steps as you've seen here, and replace the text like step 1 with a comment to say what you're going to be doing in that step. Now, there's also an attribute of steps that makes them even more interesting beyond just documentation. They can actually control the flow of your, both the flow of your particular application, but also how your the flow of your workflow, but they can also control the rights and privileges or the account that your workflow runs under. So there's a special kind of step called the impersonation step, and you can see it at the top of this diagram. Now, when you deploy a workflow or create a workflow, the workflow will actually, by default, run with the permissions of the user that started it. So if it's an automated workflow and someone changes an item in a list and that starts the workflow, it'll run as their account. If they start the workflow manually, it'll run as their account. So in the case of a workflow where you want that workflow to execute with elevated permissions, you can actually use this impersonation step. And all of the actions that happen within this impersonation step will actually run as the workflow author or the person that actually deployed the workflow. So if you want to do something that a normal user isn't going to have, you would need to do it in these steps. The impersonation step needs to be the first step within the workflow. So if you can get all of your highly privileged or elevated privilege kind of work done in that step, and then do the rest of the work in lower privilege steps later, that's the way to do it. A little bit on impersonation. There's one more step that I wanted to talk about. If you look at under step 3 there, you can see that I'm nesting steps in there so you can have them be nested. But under step 3, I have what's called a parallel step. Parallel steps, all of the steps within that step will be run in parallel. So if you've got something like you want to send an email and then start checking out a document and modifying it, and you don't need to wait for that to be done serially, you can actually do them parallel. Just drop a parallel step in there and then put actions and conditions or more steps in there. Yeah, so for the sake of the recording, is there a reason why they didn't go with the same workflow designer that we have like in Visual Studio, right? As far as the implementation of the workflow designer. Yeah, and I think the thinking behind that was that they wanted this to be something that was usable by power users. You didn't have to be a developer. And my guess is they started showing people the Visual Studio 2010 workflow designer, and it put some people off. So it's really easy to learn. You'll see here in a second. It is different, but yeah, it's pretty easy to get up and running with. Okay, so we talked about impersonation steps. Let's actually go into SharePoint Designer and start implementing this workflow. So I've exported it. And the next thing that I want to do is open up SharePoint Designer and go to my site and open that. And you can see here down on the navigation page or the navigation pane in Site Objects, I can look at all the lists, the site pages, site assets, and so on. And I have this item called Workflows. And here you can see all the different workflows that I currently have deployed. This is a new site that I created before our session today. And this particular site just has the built-in workflows, the approval, collect feedback, and collect signatures workflows. Now I can create a new one of those just by saying, copy and modify, and then I'll create a new workflow based on that workflow that I can extend. Or I can create a new list-based workflow or site-based workflow or reusable workflow. But what I want to do, just to save myself some typing for the sake of the demo, is I actually want to import that Visio file, that WVI file that I just created. And here's a really important decision that I want to make in SharePoint Designer. If I just want to create a workflow that just deploy it to that one particular site and never use it again other than in that site, you can go ahead and create like a list-based workflow. If you want to deploy it as part of an overall solution, go ahead and select reusable workflow. And I'm going to actually base it on the content type that I created in the session yesterday, this purchasing manager non-standard business purchase request. So I'll select that content type and say finish. Now it's going to open up this designer, and if you look at the flow of this workflow, you'll see that it pretty much maps directly to that diagram that I was just looking at. It's just taking those Visio shapes and turning them into SharePoint Designer sentences. So you can see here, if you read this from top to bottom, start approval process on this item with these users, then log this message to the workflow history list, and then if this value, you apply this test, and it's equal to this value, email some users, otherwise email some users and delete an item in a list, right? And what it did, again, is just generated a XAML for this particular workflow just from those shapes. Now, a quick thing on steps, I can add more steps if I want just by clicking on the step button here. If I wanted to add an impersonation step, you can see I have to have that as the first step within the workflow, and then all the contents of that step will be implemented as the workflow author, and it gives you that little hint here. And again, if I want to do anything parallel, I can just include a parallel step, and then all the steps that run within there are going to be run in parallel. Okay? So steps are documentation. They also control how your workflow actually functions. So I'm going to go to the workflow settings page, which is kind of like the control center for your workflow. And I'm going to make some selections here to determine how my workflow is actually going to run or behave. I'm going to click this little box here that says Show Workflow Visualization on Status Page. And that's just going to give me a little Visio diagram to represent the processing of the workflow and kind of show me where I'm at in an in-process workflow. I can control the start options. So I can either say, if I want it to be a manual start workflow, I'll just disable automatic start on item creation or disable automatic start on item change. If I want it to be a machine workflow, so something that starts automatically, I'll do this. I'll just reverse those options. You can see up here I have the opportunity to collect some information from users when the workflow starts or the workflow is associated to a content type through initiation form parameters. I can create private variables with this local variables button, or I can create columns that get associated with the list when a workflow is associated to that list. So if I wanted to create a generic workflow and just add some columns that I'm going to be using just for that workflow, that's what association columns are. I'm going to collect some data from the user just to show you how this works. So I'll create a initiation form parameter called business rationale. And then that'll automatically, I selected to have that actually, I did that kind of quickly, so let me just open it again. I can collect the information either at initiation or association, or both. I'll just do initiation for this one. So we'll see when the workflow starts, it'll collect that information. Okay? And then let's go into the workflow and actually start editing it. So again, steps are great for documentation. And I know this is a pretty simple scenario, but I'll just put some text there so you can see that you can change the text to kind of make comments in your code. And then if I click on this approval link within the sentence, you can see here I can control how the approval process is managed. So I can customize the task outcomes. By default, they're approved or rejected. I can change the completion conditions, how the approval is completed, how it's actually processed. All right, I'm just going to leave the defaults here. So I'll say start approval process, and then each one of these hyperlinks is some information I need to supply, like on this current item with these users, and this actually creates the task for me. So I want to have the approvers group. approve these items. So I'll just select them. And then I can start giving them information about what I want approval on. And this is what the task request will actually be created based on this information. I can pull in information either from my local variables or those initiation form variables or from the list itself. So I'll just say, please review this non-standard business purchase request for, and then click the ellipses button. Oh, I hate it when it does that. Yeah. And then in the tool, whenever you see this add or change lookup button, you can pull in information from the current item or from a different list or library or from the workflow itself. So I just want to pull in the title of what they had asked for within the list. Okay. And then I'm going to put the instructions in here. I'm going to say, request for, and then description, requested by, or let's put price in there, requested by, and then I want to put that business rationale, just to show that you can collect information above and beyond, what's in the actual list, and use that to help process your workflow. So I'll just click on add or change lookup, and I'll put the different fields in here, like description and the price. And I'll show this as formatted currency. And then it was requested by whoever created it. And then the business rationale, again, I can just pull that from workflow variables and parameters, and it shows me all the parameters that I have, including ones that if you create like an approval workflow, it'll have all the approval parameters in there. Okay? And that's my task recreated. And then I want to include information in the history list. So I'll say request for current item title made by, created by, and let's just put their display name in there. Approved. And I can go to workflow variables and parameters and just grab the isItemApproved variable. All right, and that's writing out to the history list, so I have documentation of what happened during the processing of the workflow. And now I'm going to ask, if the particular request was granted, so if item is approved is equal to yes, I want to send an email to the person that requested it. I'm not going to be incredibly verbose here. I'll just say request for current item title. Whoops. I keep forgetting that you need to go into the ellipses if you're going to do something other than a single value. Current item title was approved. And then, if not, okay, I'll just say rejected. Okay, and then I'll delete that item. Okay, so that's my workflow, right? I know it's a very simple case, but just kind of showing you some of the different attributes of these workflows, like actions, being able to pull information either from a workflow processing variables or information I collect, like the business rationale, or from the list itself. Now, when I'm ready to actually test this, I can go ahead and publish it directly to my site. And I'm going to publish it to my development site so I can start working with that and just testing it out there. So I'm going to click Publish, and you'll see here it'll go through, create the visualization, create the XAML file, and so on. Okay, so it's published. So I'm going to go over to my list in my site Lab01. And I'll actually associate this manually, because you can see here there's no workflows that are set to process on these items, right? This is grayed out. I'm going to associate this manually. Of course, you can do this in code. But just a couple of clicks and we'll get this associated to the list. And there you can see there's the workflow that I just created. I'll give it a name. Okay. And now when we select the item in the list, like my request to go to Tech Ed, I can click Workflows, and there's the workflow that I created. It asked me for the business rationale. And again, this is an info path form, so I could have customized this. I'd like to learn SPO. And click Start. Now, it'll take a second to start for the first time, just because of the first time I've run the workflow. Okay. So now I select the workflow, or select the item, select the workflows. You can see this workflow is in process. This is the visualization that I get from checking that one box that shows all the different steps. You'll get this just by checking the box. It doesn't have anything to do with the fact that I had based this off of a Visio diagram to start with. Here's the task. Please review this non-standard business purchase request, TechEd US 2011. If I open this, you can see it's pulling through the information based on the comment that I had made. Right? Okay, and I'll go ahead and approve that. I'm actually a member of the approvers group just to make this demo fly by. And then you can see that it updates the diagram to show the checkboxes of the path that it created, right? And it sent the email and so on. But actually what I'd like to do in this particular scenario is I want to extend this workflow to create a site to, let's say for this trip to Tech Ed, a site where whoever goes to the trip can enter like slides of the sessions they went to or put notes and things along those lines. But if you go into SharePoint Designer and look at the actions dropdown, there's no dropdown in here for creating a site. So I want to do that with a custom action. Okay, so I'll close down SharePoint Designer. Let's actually go back into the slides and talk about that for a second. So custom workflow actions, like being able to have an action in SharePoint Designer that says create site, you can do that by creating sandbox solutions that are deployed with a specific element file that maps the execution of your code into an action that's exposed within SharePoint Designer. And then when the workflow actually executes, it will call a method on your class. And again, you can do anything you can do in a sandbox solution within this particular class and method. Now, how this is actually done, again, is I create a SharePoint sandbox solution. I create a class that has the methods for the custom actions that I want. And I expose them through an instance of the workflow action schema to declaratively map the method call to the action itself. So then they show up in SharePoint Designer. And then when I use them in my workflow, I deploy both the sandbox solution for my custom actions as well as the workflow. And they work in concert to provide the feature or functionality that I want. OK? So let's actually do that over in Visual Studio. Let's go back over to the demo machine. And I'll open up Visual Studio. And I'll create a new project, and just an empty SharePoint project. And I'll call it Purchasing Manager Actions. And I'll spell it right, because that makes a huge difference in the actual functioning of my demo. And then Visual Studio will ask me, is this going to be a sandbox solution? And I want to use it in SharePoint Online, so it has to be. OK? And then I'm going to add a class here to provide the implementation of my custom function. So I'll call this Create Site Action. And click Add. And then all I need here is methods that conform to the signature, a particular signature that's used by the workflow engine when it calls into custom code. So I've got some snippets here to save you watching me type. So I'll use Microsoft.SharePoint, Microsoft.SharePoint.user code. This has to be a public class, so it can be called by the execution of the workflow. And then I'll implement a feature here, and a method. My method is called createSite. Okay? And what I want to be able to do is I want the workflow to pass me the name of the site that it's going to create. It also has to pass me some sort of context. Actually, it's going to pass me the context the workflow is running under. And just like SharePoint context, the SP user code workflow context actually gives me access to the site that I'm running in and the lists and libraries, just like SharePoint context does. And then I can return results back to the workflow via a hash table. So for example, I'll create an instance of the hash table called results. And then using the context, I'll get the current web URL to create a site, which I'll use to open the web. And then I'll say web.webs.add. And I'll use the site name parameter that's passed to me to name that site and give it a title. Okay? And I'm just going to base it on a team site in the language English, right? And then if everything works well, I'm just going to add to the hash table success equals true, and then the exception parameter, or the exception property equal to string.empty. If it was the reverse, if something went wrong, I'd capture the exception and throw that. So I can pass that back to the executing workflow. Okay? So I'll just compile that, make sure everything went well. But now, how do I actually get that workflow or get that particular action surfaced in SharePoint Designer so it can be called? And when it is called, how do I get the right parameters passed into this method call? Well, I do that with an element file. So I'm just going to right-click and say Add New Item. And click Empty Element. I'll call this Create Site Action Definition. And click Add. Okay. And there's my elements file. And again, as I had mentioned, what I want to do here is provide an implementation of the workflow actions SharePoint schema. And for each action that I want to surface, I'll create a new action element. And you can see here, I've got a little error in my snippet, so let me just do a little copy-paste. So you can see here, I've got a new action called Create Site. And it's going to be coming from, it's in a sandbox solution. It's coming from an assembly, the current assembly that I'm deployed, right? The class name is purchasemageractions.createSiteAction, and the function name is createSite. And it's going to put it in a category within SharePoint Designer called Purchasing Manager Workflow Actions. Okay, so now it knows where it's going to find that code and what method to call. I want a sentence to show up in SharePoint Designer when I add this action to my workflow. So I'll define that with the rule designer element. You can see here it has an attribute called sentence. And that sentence reads, create site with name %1, exceptions logged to %2. Again, what this is doing is it's providing information to SharePoint Designer as what sentence to show when you inject this item or this action into the workflow, and then the fields that you can use to bind those variables, those hyperlinks you click on. Like one's going to be called site name, and the other one's going to be called, or provide the text in the sentence called site name and exception, and they're going to be called site name and exception respectively. And then the final thing is that I want to map those little things that I fill out in that sentence into the parameters that I'm going to call on the method. And I do that with the parameters elements. So here you can see this is how I get the context, is I create a special parameter called underbar context, direction in, and it's hidden. It's just passed to me by the execution of the workflow. Another parameter called site name, and since it has the same name as that field up above, it's going to pass whatever I put in the field into the site name parameter. Right? And same thing with exception. That's an out parameter, and I'm going to get that by just returning that hash table. Right? And that's my implementation. One quick thing that I need to do on the feature is that the feature actually has to be scoped to the site collection. And I'll just give it a pretty name so it's easier to see. Okay. And let's go ahead and build this. And I'm going to hit F5, which will deploy the feature up into my site. And I can test it by implementing a workflow that uses it. Let's go ahead and click F5. And it adds this solution, deploys the features. And now if I go back into SharePoint Designer and open my site again, if everything went as planned, I can open the workflow, go into edit mode, and then put the cursor here, and then click Action. And then there's the Purchase Manager workflow actions and the Create Site action. And you can see here, here's the little fill in the blanks for site name. And I'm just going to call it current item title. And then if I wanted to map the exception or the results, if something went wrong, into like a local variable and write that to a history list or something along those lines, I could do that with this hyperlink. But what I'll do is I'll just go ahead and publish. Let's test this out. So I'm working directly against the site, so it's going to replace the old workflow with a new version. Just give it a new version number. So when it's done validating, packaging, creating the visualization and all that stuff, we can go in and do that. There we go. So let me go back into my list. Go workflows. You can see here's the one that I just read, or just did, and it gave it a version. So let's try custom action. And again, it takes a bit to start up for the first time, just because it's, crunching down the XAML into something you can execute. Okay, so you can see again it's in progress. I'll select workflows. In progress workflow. And you can see it updated the visualization to show the custom action in there. And let's go ahead and approve this guy and see the site get created. Okay, so it's going to take a second to create the site. You can see I've got some check marks here and then some processing graphics. Okay. So site actions, view all site content, and then we scroll down a bit, and then there's the site that was created by my custom action. Okay? Just as an example of how you can apply code to declarative workflows. So it's kind of like one of those things like get as much of the work as you can through SharePoint Designer with the out-of-the-box activities, and whatever else you need to do, create custom actions for it. And it's just a matter of creating a SharePoint feature that deploys classes with methods using the Sandbox Solutions API, and then mapping them into SharePoint Designer, just like I did here today. Okay? But then the next thing that I want to do is, of course, this is all locally. I want to deploy this to run up in the cloud in SharePoint Online. So how do I do that? Well, the only way that I can deploy a solution to execute in the cloud, to run code on the server up in SharePoint Online, is through Sandbox Solutions. So I need this workflow as a Sandbox solution. But luckily, if I go over to the workflow settings page, there's this Save As Template option here. And when I click this, it takes all of the files for the workflow out of the workflow document library and packages them up as a WSP in Site Assets. So if I go over to Site Assets and click Refresh, there's the WSP. And I'll go ahead and download that to my machine. Let me just give it a unique name. Okay. Oops. Actually, I wanted that. Where did I put that? Let's just download it again. Oh, I put it in the right place. I just wanted to make sure that I got the one that I actually just created so you could see it working. Okay? And then I want to package up the entire solution, so not just the workflow. If the custom action isn't there, the workflow is going to bomb because it's not going to find the class, the assembly class and method that it expects. So I'll go here and I'll just right-click and say package. And then let's go over to SharePoint Online. Okay, so here's my SharePoint Online site, so .sharepoint.com. I'll go to the solution gallery. Okay, and deploying sandbox solutions is just as easy as uploading a file. So I'll upload and activate them in order, and of course I could do this with feature dependencies, but here I'm just going to do it manually. I will first package up or upload the custom action, just due to the dependency. Make sure that's activated. So when I upload the actual workflow, it's already there. So there it is, 334. Okay, and we'll activate that guy as well. Okay, so let's go into Lab 01, which is the site that I'm actually going to be testing with, and just turn on that feature. Okay, and just for the sake of the demo, I'm doing this all manually. So you can see here's the workflow template, non-standard business purchase approval from web template Lab 01. You can, of course, crack this open and give it a more descriptive name, but that's what you get out of the box. Okay, so that's activated. Let's associate the workflow and test it to make sure that it runs online just like it did on-prem. So I'll go lists, workflow settings, and I'll associate it like I did last time. There's my workflow. And click OK, and then let's actually use it. Okay, so I took the sandbox solution that had my actual code, as well as the sandbox solution that had my declarative workflow. I deployed them both. I associated them to a list. And now they're available for me to use within my list. Okay? So this is running in SPO. Okay, and I'll take a second to start up for the first time. Drum roll, please, or at least a little progress icon. Okay. Let's go into the workflow, the in-progress workflow. And there's the diagram, so we know it's the new one that we updated. Let me go ahead and approve this guy. And again, it'll take a second to start for the first time, or complete for the first time, because it's running through all these steps for the first time. Now, all of the demos and samples that I'm showing today, they're actually something that we've shipped as an online training kit for SharePoint Online, and I'll show you that, and I'll show you a link to that here in a second. So you can do labs similar to this. So labs for SharePoint Online, labs for Link Online, and labs for Exchange Online when you get back to the office. But there you can see the workflow processed as we would expect that it would. And if I say view all site content, there's the site that was created by my custom action. Okay? So a very quick and simple example, but a great tour of how you can create workflows in SharePoint Designer, right, with conditions and actions, steps to control impersonation, where they're going to run sequentially or they're going to run in parallel, and then how you can extend those workflows with sandbox solutions. And again, anything you can do in a sandbox solution with the scoped Microsoft.SharePoint DLL or API, you can do in a sandbox solution. Like, for example, here I created a site using the team site template. But again, you can create as many custom actions as you want and deploy those as a sandbox solution with the rest of your solution. And then deployment and executing in SharePoint Online, very easy. I just save my workflow as a template, which creates a WSP that I can package up with the rest of my WSPs, and then I can upload those to run in the cloud with SharePoint Online. And then, as you can see here, we just ran that same workflow that we were running on-prem, running online, up in the cloud with SharePoint Online. Okay? Oh, before we go back over there, if you want to go and do these labs, if you go to msdn.com or do labs similar to these, I kind of did a greatest hits in this one. Just click on the Learn link, Featured Training Courses, and scroll down until you see Office 365. And then you can download the training kit. We also have the labs online, including videos you can watch of presentations kind of highlighting different areas of the kit and so on. And then you can do the lab. And we've got about 23 different labs and about 9 hours worth of video for everything from SharePoint Online development to Link Online and Exchange Online development. Okay? And of course, you'll need access to Office 365. And we're in beta now, so if you just go up to office365.com and click the Join the Beta link, you can get your own beta tenancy and use that to evaluate, provide feedback, and in these cases, do the development labs and get started doing development with Office 365. Okay? So that's workflow development with SharePoint Online. You can prototype in Visio 2010. You can implement the workflow in SharePoint Designer, either starting a workflow from scratch, copying an existing workflow and extending it, or importing a Visio diagram, and then build out the rest of the workflow using the actions and the conditions and the steps. And again, actions do work, the conditions control the flow, and the steps are either used for documentation or to control how actions and conditions are actually executed. When you find something in a scenario that you'd like to implement that isn't supported by the built-in actions or what comes out of the box, just go ahead and open up Visual Studio and create a sandbox solution mapping the methods that do the work that you want to do into SharePoint Designer using the workflow schema, and you've got a custom workflow action that you can distribute with your workflow as an overall solution, as part of your overall solution. And again, the cool thing about creating these workflows as reusable workflows is, of course, you can distribute them. You can distribute them as WSPs using that Save As Template feature in SharePoint Designer. Now, what I did is I put a ton of resources in here, everything from white papers to the training course. And I provided links to download SharePoint Designer and a couple of cool walkthroughs I thought were helpful. And then I listed all of the different sessions here at TechEd that I thought would be worthwhile. Again, I'm sure you've heard this quite often during the course of the week. Please fill out your evals. We'd love to get your feedback on this and other sessions. And again, I appreciate you spending the hour here with me to talk about workflows in SharePoint Online and Microsoft. We, in general, really appreciate the fact that you took the week away from the office and away from your normal day-to-day work, getting things done and creating software to spend time here with us at TechEd. And thank you very much for coming to this session. I hope you guys have safe travels on the way home. So thank you.